Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are doing well today. Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar on managing, reducing waste and management of allergen in the food sector. My name is Titi Susanti, Director of Food and Retail Asia Pacific at PSI Group, and I will be your moderator for this webinar today. In this webinar, we will have three experts who will be presenting and sharing their insight and knowledge on different topics. So for the first speaker, we will have Todd Redwood, Managing Director, Global Food and Retail at PSI. Todd will present about food safety and sustainability trends in the food and beverage industry. And then we will have Jasmine Lessis Lee. She is President and Board Chair of Australia Allergen Bureau and Food Safety Manager for Allergen and Microbiology at BVAQ. She will be presenting about managing food allergen in the food sector. And then we have Leanne Singleton, Technical Specialist with Stop Food Waste Australia, who will be presenting about reducing food loss and waste. And then at the end of the last presentation, we will have Q&A for about 15-20 minutes. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. So all lines will be muted during the webinar. We have a lot of participants today, so this will help to reduce any background noise and ensure that everyone can hear the speakers clearly. And then secondly, please feel free to ask questions during the session using the Q&A chat box. Our expert will be happy to answer your questions after their presentations during the Q&A sessions. And then finally, a recording and presentation materials of this webinar will be shared after the session. Okay, so I think we can start. So without a further ado, let's get started. And I would like to call our first speaker, Todd Redwood. Todd, over to you.
Vivek, thank you very much, Titi, and welcome to everyone to our webinar today. Really good to have you all with us. So, as Titi mentioned, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of some of the trends in food safety as well as sustainability regarding the food and beverage industry. And yeah, quite interesting and exciting space here. Lots going on. What I'm doing here is just giving an overview right now of what the Consumer Goods Forum, which is the overarching, probably the largest food and consumer goods related organisation in the world that deals with manufacturers and retailers. This is what their priorities are. They've got 4 pillars across the top and 8 coalitions of action that they address issues with. One of them is safety. So that's food safety. That's the Global Food Safety Initiative, or GFSI as we well know it. And this GFSI coalition of action has been dealing with safety or food safety now for over 20 years. Some other coalitions of actions have emerged, and these ones here that have got the red dots around them are related to the social and environmental sustainability piece. So what we can see here is that if you look across the industry at what's important, of those 8 coalitions of action, 6 of them relate to what we're talking about here today. So other than what we are going to talk about a little later with Jasmine and Leanne, because of course allergen management's important. It's a critical factor of food safety, and it's something that's creating a lot of issues. So Jasmine's going to talk about that in detail. And food waste is something that's emerging. It's been going on for a long time, but for the first time in history, we've seen food waste included in a food safety standard. So a private food safety standard, FSSC 22,000 this year, included food waste management as part of the criteria for certification. So I won't talk about those two because they'll be talked about in detail later. But what I do want to talk about is food safety culture. So if we have a look at, just very quickly, I'm going to skip through here, 600 million people, almost 1 in 10 people in the world fall ill and 420,000 of those die each year, resulting in the loss of about 33 million healthy life years every year. That's quite scary. And even though we've had tacit-based food safety systems since the 1960s that were put together to put man into space, with NASA and the Pillsbury Company, we still get food recalls, we get withdrawals, incidents, events. They continue. So something's still not working. And so some work's been done. GFSI in 2017 came out and defined that a company's food safety culture is the shared values, norms, and beliefs that affect mindsets and behaviours towards food safety in, across, and throughout the company. So it's a company-wide culture. It's a company-wide thing that addresses whether an organisation is or isn't going to be food safe. Now, every organisation has a food safety culture in the food and beverage industry. It just depends whether it's healthy and mature or whether it's immature. And the common denominator in food safety culture is always people. Somewhere, someone somewhere got something wrong with their values, beliefs, and behaviour, and or their understanding of food safety, which leads to food safety incidents normally. That's the usual scenario. The industry's discussed this at length, and there were lots of whys and whats about food safety culture, but there'd been a missing link. There's a missing piece about how to, practical guidance behind that. And that was why a few years ago, at the end of 2019 and early 2020, BSI embarked on an ambitious program to be able to produce this, which has been released in April this year, PAS 320, 2023, Developing and Sustaining a Mature Food Safety Culture. It's a guide. That QR code is shown now. You can just scan that and download that one for free. It's a guide that gives you the ability to understand how to mature and sustain and continually improve a food safety culture within the organisation. So this is a very big breakthrough, and now we've started seeing this to be referenced. So FSSC 22000 has now referenced this as one of the tools to be used for the development of food safety culture. Moving out of that food safety culture now into sustainability, there are 5 different areas here in the trends of what's hot to trot in sustainability focus for the F&B industry. Reducing food waste, which I won't go into any detail, responsible and clean energy consumption, packaging efficiency, resilient and responsible sourcing, and water stewardship. These are the 5 main areas, the 5 trends that we see coming through. So food waste, very briefly, but Leanne's going to go into much more detail soon, but an enormous amount of food is wasted, and at the same time we've got a hungry population that's not being fed. There's food insecurity. An enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the food and beverage industry, and they say that around 8 to 10% of those are coming from food waste itself. So we need to do something about that. It's very low-hanging fruit for our industry. I'll leave Leanne to talk in more detail about that. Responsible and clean energy consumption. Around 30% of global energy is consumed by the agriculture and the food sector. So, just under a third of energy in the world is used by our sector, and more than 70% of that is used post-farm gate. So it's in the manufacturing and production piece. There are some solutions for that. There's energy management systems, ISO 50001, and other renewable energy options to be able to be used. So these are some considerations here that the industry could take on board. Packaging efficiency. 15% of greenhouse gas emissions come from landfill waste, and 68% of packaging waste is from the food industry. 5 trillion plastic bags are used globally every year, and so whilst we've seen some countries move towards no single-use plastic bags, there's still plenty of them being used around the world. 481 billion plastic bottles are made every year, and less than 10% of plastic waste is actually recycled globally. More than 90% of plastic waste goes into landfill, therefore, and is incinerated or polluting the environment. So a really, really big problem, and plastic being one of the biggest parts of that issue in packaging efficiency. We need to look for better solutions, better packaging that leads to less waste. Resilient and responsible sourcing. The circular economy, we can actually design waste and pollution out of our food and beverage industry by looking right up front. But there's of course lots of other issues as well that associated with that fit under that big ESG or sustainability banner, the human rights issues and sustainable materials and other resource management. Looking for sometimes third-party accredited certifications, second-party audits of supply chains up and down the supply chains, social responsibility audits up and down the supply chains as well, and life cycle assessment added in there for looking at a more resilient and responsible sourcing process. And then also water stewardship. Only 3% of the world's water is fresh, and only 1% of that is actually available to us because 2% of it is frozen in the glaciers and the ice caps. So 70% of fresh water available to us is used in agriculture. We really need to be careful of this very, very precious resource. So a solution there, ISO 46001 water management standard, can be used to try to prevent the loss of water and minimise the disposal of water. So, one of the solutions here, overarching sort of an umbrella one, is ISO 14001. It's a standard that's been around for a long time. BSI first wrote the ISO 14001 standard as a British standard many decades ago. But it's the world's #1 environmental standard, and it's the one that helps put a business on autopilot for sustainability and environmental management. From that, you can use it as a framework to be able to hang all the other management systems from. So it's an incredibly important one to consider as a foundation. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are really, really important to us. Last week I was in Singapore at an event, and almost every single person at that event was wearing a badge on their lapel with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals at this sustainability event. And so the awareness is really increasing. What's great is that some of the standards that I've mentioned already today actually align with many of those goals. So if you have a look at the top one, 14001 is aligning with a whole range of the Sustainable Development Goals. 46001 aligns with 14064 for greenhouse gas reporting reduction, relates to 2, and ISO 50001 relates to 4. So there's actually a very, very strong alignment between some of these standards that we're talking about for the benefit of management of sustainability and those UN Sustainable Development Goals. So from the point of view of your journey and sustainability, looking first as phase 1, 14001 is a foundation at your facilities and sites. Environmental risk management, water management, food waste management, greenhouse gas reporting and reduction, and energy management. Second stage or phase, engaging the supply chain, so looking at their issues up and down the supply chain, and then finally celebrating outcomes, within the globe of your entire ecosystem. So it's a very, very interesting space, and that. The space is emerging. It's not going away. We've got huge challenges ahead of us, and we really owe it to the generations that will follow us. So it's very important that we, as the industry, get on board and do what we need to do. So thank you very much for your time today, and really happy to be able to hand you over to our next presenter today.
Thank you, Todd. And let's call our second speakers. Jasmine, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Titi and Rod and BSI, for inviting the Allergen Bureau to present on the webinar today. It's a great opportunity to share our story and again, to Todd's point, share why managing allergens in the food sector is obviously such an important thing that we need to be considering as we move forward. So for those of you that may be new to industry or may not have heard much around the Allergen Bureau, I wanted to spend 2 seconds just simply introducing who we are and letting those of you that may not know that we are a membership-based industry organisation. So we've been around since 2005, and we're really established at the early part of mandatory allergen labelling requirements within the Australian-New Zealand sector, because industry needed support around how they were going to introduce the new labelling requirements, but most importantly, seeking more guidance on standardisation around allergen management and the risk assessment piece. So I've been proud to be part of the Bureau now since 2018, and like the other directors, provide that commitment on a voluntary basis. And Leanne mentioned earlier, it's allergens is a passion for her, and indeed it is for me, which is sort of why we're all contributing to this space. So again, jump on the Allergen Bureau's website and have a look at what is available there, and feel free to challenge whether you should become a member. So just very quickly, covering off things that really need to be considered from an allergen management perspective, and then I'll touch also how those allergen management practices can feed into your business's ability to conduct risk assessments, and how that then influences communication appropriately to the consumer. And last but not least, we'll touch on what we know is happening at an international level with respect to Codex's review currently of the priority allergens, and some other specific areas that will, I think, come into play over the next coming years. So for those of you, obviously, that have been in industry for a while, will have heard the terms allergen management and allergen review. And I just wanted to touch on, I guess, semantics. We can use these terms sometimes interchangeably. Essentially, like all things, we're talking about food safety systems and certification and standards, anything that we do needs to be documented. But, through our process of conducting a risk review, it's how we essentially determine where our risks are. And then once we've determined where they are, how we control them, that obviously then feeds into our overarching allergen management program. So the Allergen Bureau developed in 2017 a risk review website. So this was developed through conjunction with industry feedback, which is how a lot of our resources are developed, and designed as an interactive factory map that you as a user can jump into and have a look. And you'll see that there's 15 different little areas or infographics that you can click on, and each area will provide you with further guidance across that sort of food sector, that you can see incoming raw materials all the way through to product being packaged, and any of the other support services or departments in your business that impact your allergen management strategies, or can contribute to your allergen risk, I should say, as well. So definitely a very useful tool there to help you understand what the right questions are to ask as you start to consider what your allergen risks might be in certain areas of your business. And so then obviously noting that, sort of what you find through that risk review process is going to impact and feed into your allergen management process. Like many, quality systems that we have in place, we will expect that your business should have an allergen management policy, with obviously management engagement there, and then all the procedures and practices that underpin the application and successful execution of that allergen management protocol within your business. You can see there, obviously, it's a foundation based on a robust food safety plan and GMP, and I'll cover that off in a second. Obviously, HACCP plans become quite a critical piece of your allergen management program, and the way that you manage risk within your facilities. And again, it's important to sort of, we've got there, include the life cycle of your product from raw materials all the way through. And obviously, at any point that something changes, there needs to be an alert back to the business to sort of touch in, assess whether there's a risk that's changed. And then obviously establishing systems such as these help businesses prevent the unintentional cross-contact of allergens into other products. So you'll see, hopefully by the end of the presentation, how all of these things that we'll cover off are really, really key to ensuring that your business understands risk, manages it appropriately, and then obviously communicates it effectively to the consumer. From an Allergen Bureau's remit, we would always, and have for many years, said that a HACCP-based food safety program is definitely the starting point, but really needs to be adapted for your allergen controls. And the reason that we say that is that if we think about our HACCP programs, generally they're a very process step-driven focus. We look at the risks that occur in each step of a particular process, identify those risks and control them. And anyone on the webinar today that has ever been involved in a HACCP risk assessment process will know that those lovely prerequisite programs that you can see there at that second last point are the ones that we really actually rely on to control a lot of the risks that we might see within our facilities. And so, where we rely heavily on cleaning, for example, to manage a allergen risk or other food safety risks, that would be considered a prerequisite program. We challenge businesses to almost conduct a HACCP risk assessment on their prerequisite programs, because anyone that's been through this risk assessment process will normally go, oh, that's in the prerequisite program, that's covered by somebody else normally, some other department's responsibility. But we do need to make sure that ultimately any other program that we have in our business that we're assuming is effectively identifying and managing risks is doing so effectively. It's important to note, in this global supply chain that we have, that many businesses will have food manufacturing sites within one country, but definitely across the globe. So it's important to acknowledge that each facility's allergen management program is definitely unique to their site and their business. And that consideration needs to be sort of given as we go through identifying and managing our risks. So, taking into key considerations as well as the traditional, I guess, food safety approaches, but looking at, who is our target market? Who are we selling our product to? Are we selling a product that could have allergen cross contact into a high risk vulnerable group? And are we putting a claim on it? So there's all these other things that we need to consider around the products that we're producing and the impact that might have to the allergic consumer at the end of the day. Thinking about the complexity of your manufacturing facility, thinking about the number of allergens that you have, the type, so the form, are they particulates, are they homogeneous or readily dispersible, how much protein is actually present in these things. So you can see that the complexity required to sort of develop and implement an allergen management program is there, but definitely achievable and obviously done by many businesses currently quite effectively. So again, this slide is just to demonstrate the resources that the Allergen Bureau has available. So as you look to maybe implement an allergen management program, whether it's to review your allergen management program, the Allergen Bureau has lots of resources available freely for you to download, work your way through, and you'll see that there are other documents such as the Unexpected Allergens in Foods document, which is a great example that will give you guidance on what allergens you might expect to see in certain types of ingredients or within the agricultural sectors as well. So great resources there. So keeping in mind that, even as part of our HACCP risk assessment, we use those words risk assessment. The risk assessment generally is considered then, there's a definition from Codex, a scientific evaluation of known or potential adverse health effects resulting from the human exposure of foodborne hazards, remembering obviously there that the allergens are foodborne hazards. And so we've got our HACCP risk assessment as a starting point, but then the Allergen Bureau over many years has developed and refined our vital risk assessment process. And this is essentially a process that all businesses can use to truly understand, I guess, the allergen cross contact that occurs both in your incoming goods as well as the risk posed within your facilities. And by actually conducting a vital risk assessment underpinned by the vital program, and I'll cover that off in a minute, is really a great example of a science-based risk assessment. And definitely know that it's available there for you to use and guide your way through that as well. So when we look at, well, why would you want to implement the vital program? Why would you want to conduct a vital risk assessment? Really, at the end of the day, it's about ensuring that we're able to provide, irrespective of where you are in our food supply chain or where your business is based, that we're providing accurate and consistent allergen declarations to the consumer so that they can make an informed choice really at the end of the day around what foods are safe for them to eat. and obviously there we're also, you can see there's comments there around, having gone through this process will also mean that as a business, if you're able to demonstrate that you've implemented a program such as this, that, you're communicating around the fact that you've got good due diligence, you've got commitment to consumers. Ultimately, we were talking about recalls prior to the webinar starting, having a robust risk assessment system in place will obviously also mean that you're going to be hopefully avoiding compliance costs or recalls that may occur as well. So Todd had asked, for me to cover off in the discussion today, just a little bit around the VITAL program. And so just, sort of building on the allergen management piece that we've spoken about, the VITAL program was developed by the Allergen Bureau, again, about 2007. So the concept has been around for quite a significant period of time now, and was developed to provide a consistent method to be able to assess and declare allergens, which are not intentionally formulated into our products. And then obviously to address them, therefore, the needs of those allergic consumers that are going to be consuming our products. And I think it's important, one of the misconceptions that we often hear is that the VITAL program is not applicable to ingredient manufacturers, and that definitely is not the case. If you're making ingredients or you're making a finished product, the implementation of this program, or a philosophy almost as we like to call it, it is definitely key to reducing business risk and obviously communicating that throughout the supply chain as well. The intent, when the Allergen Bureau looked at starting to develop the program, was really with and I want to say sort of foresight and this intent that one day we would end up looking at having global harmonized thresholds, that everyone around the world would be able to tie themselves to and be able to then use those thresholds to underpin this risk assessment approach. So it doesn't matter where you were in the world, if you are assessing the risk of cross-contact in a chocolate chip cookie, for example, if you're here in Australia or in the US, that there was a standardisation and harmonisation as to how that approach was going to happen. So within the Australian-New Zealand sector, obviously where the VITAL program was born, you can see there the first iteration was released in 2007. And it's really important to note here that food businesses use this VITAL program on a voluntary basis. So it's definitely not managed under our Australian-New Zealand Food Standards Code system. And that's obvious. That's feedback that we often get from a lot of our international colleagues, is that they actually can't understand how on earth is the food industry coming together collectively to implement what is considered the best practice approach really for allergen management and risk communication. There's obviously within our sector, Australia and New Zealand are very well established users of the particular program, but we also see that there's a reasonable level of acknowledgement through our regulatory and enforcement agencies with respect to the program, deferring to the thresholds that we use there as well, and an expectation that this is best practice and industry should be looking at adopting it if they haven't. The VITAL reference doses, which have been probably spoken about most significantly in the last sort of 12 to 18 months more than ever before, really underpin the science of the VITAL program and the concept of action levels, and at what point do we need to alert a consumer that there's enough allergen present in a particular product that's not intentionally formulated appropriately. So that's where that PAL, or precautionary allergen labelling piece, really sort of starts to come to play. And important to note as well that we do know around the world that there are other regulators and enforcement agencies that look to the VITAL reference doses and action levels when they're looking at food recalls as well. So it's definitely not just a program that's isolated to our area. So as I stated, sort of the VITAL program itself is managed by the Allergen Bureau, and the intent really there was to provide that consistent methodology for the food industry, no matter where you were, to assess the impact of allergen cross-contact and provide that appropriate allergen labelling statement. So what do you need to actually implement the VITAL program? You need an allergen management plan, and you need to have assessed where your risks are, what your controls are, and have some level of validation and verification in place. So obviously we need, those policies, procedures and practices that are really underpinning and providing that start of the due diligence process within your business. Without that, you're going to find this process obviously a very hard one to get through and start. So clearly, this is quite a robust scientific process, and just really touching on the concepts today as opposed to delving very deeply into them. The risk assessment itself is really underpinned by the four bubbles there that you can see. So a combination of the reference dose. So the reference dose is what we would explain as the dose that's required to elicit a response in an allergic individual. Combined with the reference amount. So how much does the consumer eat? So if the consumer eats a cupcake that weighs 150 grams, will they receive the reference dose? That obviously is converted through a calculation to what we know as the action level, so the concentration of the allergenic protein that is present. And through this risk assessment outcome, depending upon what that concentration is, if the dose is at the level at which a response could occur in an allergic individual, then we would need to apply a precautionary allergen labelling statement on our product. If it was below that level, then it's below the level that we know would be likely to elicit a response, so we don't need to have a PAL. So that's a very simplistic way of, I guess, explaining the vital risk assessment to you. But hopefully in the next couple of slides, you'll also start to see why the vital program and the vital risk assessment sort of moving into the future hopefully will be a tool that your business might find quite important if you haven't embarked on that journey. So some of you will be aware that Codex 2 years ago now looked at a complete review of the general standard for labelling of prepackaged foods with a specific focus on assessing and reviewing the priority allergens that sit within Codex. And obviously that list hasn't really been reviewed since it was developed in 1999. So definitely, required a review there. And the questions there were raised by the Codex Committee, impacting obviously the Food Labelling Committee and also the Committee for Food Hygiene. And basically they requested that a expert panel be convened to actually conduct a risk assessment of these priority allergens and start looking at a few other key elements as we move into the future of harmonisation. So I just want to touch on this. You'll see that there's some of the expert panel members there that you can see on your screen that will have a nice little green circle around them. So those expert panel members, either currently or in the past, have also provided their voluntary scientific expertise to the vital scientific expert panel. So, where you may have heard about those vital reference doses for all of these years, these lovely scientists and experts have provided all of their blood, sweat and tears into helping the Allergen Bureau sort of move forward and develop this risk assessment approach. So I just wanted to really touch very briefly on what we know is happening internationally and what, there's still a little bit of uncertainty as to what we think might happen, but this is definitely hopefully going to explain what the remit was from the expert panel and what the future might look like depending upon where Codex ends up. So the expert panel was tasked with three overarching things to consider. So to validate and update that priority list that we see within Codex, to establish threshold levels for foods for those priority allergens, and then to evaluate the evidence in support for what would be required for precautionary allergen labelling. So there are the three final reports. So there's still one more report on exemptions to be issued by the expert panel, but all freely available on the FAO, WHO websites if you're wanting to jump on there and have a look. So just very briefly, sort of having a bit of a look at the recommendations that have gone to Codex. So at this stage, the recommendations for what we're terming the new global priority allergens would be the ones there that you can see on your screen. So cereals containing gluten, so wheat, rye and barley, crustacea, milk, eggs, peanuts, sesame and fish. And you'll see there with respect to the specific tree nuts that we've got almond, cashew, hazelnut, pecan, pistachio and walnut. And so there's a few there that have got some X's that you'll see on the infographic. And again, based on the data that they've reviewed, so the number of people globally that suffer from these particular food allergies, the severity at which the reactions occur, and how much protein is required to elicit these responses, this is kind of where they've landed with their recommendations. So there's obviously some in there, for example, soy, that has not been recommended to be on the global Codex list. They've also developed what they've called a Codex watch list, so things like pulses, insects and kiwi fruit. So where we've got good evidence that food allergy for some of these commodities might be increasing, or where we know that there might be, sort of with respect to insects, sort of cross-reactivity with other proteins, and obviously an increase of some of these proteins within the food supply chain as well. So part 2 was to have a look at reviewing and establishing thresholds for these priority allergens for the use of precautionary allergen labelling. And you can see there that really where they landed was that it's been based after a lot of scientific review from the wider expert panel based on the reference doses that we see used in the VITAL program. The difference being that they've gone with what is known as an eliciting dose 05, so expecting up to 5% of those that suffer from food allergy having mild transient reactions. So the VITAL program at the moment is based on an ED01. So there's a slight shift there, and again, that is about trying to find a balance between, I guess, public health impact as well as food availability for those with food allergies. So, and the other important piece of the puzzle there is the analysis. So ensuring that any analytical results are able to be compared to a risk assessment outcome. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide with respect to their recommendations to precautionary allergen labelling, but ultimately the recommendations to Codex have been that PAL should only be used for unintended allergen present. So, that's based on having good GMP in place, allergen management programs in place, and cannot be prevented even with all those wonderful controls that you might have within your facilities, and only when it exceeds the reference dose. So again, really you can see there that the concepts of the VITAL program and the risk assessment that have been around for a long time will hopefully help businesses, if you've already implemented these risk assessments in your facilities, be one step ahead depending upon what happens with Codex. But obviously for those of you that might be sitting here listening today, know that there are these tools available to help you start down this road in readiness for what may happen in the future. And I say may because we don't know. You can see there's recommendations around some kind of label indication, so that if a risk assessment has been done, that there's a display on the label so that food allergic individuals know whether it's a safer choice or not. There's recommendations around potential wording. So the term around, not suitable for, and then obviously there's a very key piece there within that last dot point, as you can see, significant education required not only for the food industry, but other health professionals, as well as those with food allergy themselves, to sort of understand the philosophy of how these risk assessments will work and what it actually means for them from a public health impact perspective. So just wrapping up very quickly, I've taken you through the very quick world of allergen management and risk assessment there, but I just really recapping that, let's have those allergen management plans and practices and policies in place. Conducting a thorough risk review, so understanding where your risks are and controlling them. And the one thing that I haven't mentioned that I will just before I wrap up is that, although we've spoken about the VITAL program helping risk communication through the use of PAL when it's required, the VITAL program philosophy really is almost a seek and destroy approach. So find where your risks are and have a hierarchy of control starting at eliminate. So can you eliminate the allergen? If not, what can you do to either, reduce the risk, engineer it out. So all of those similar hierarchies and controls that you have in other areas of your business applying to your allergen risks. And then obviously, last but not least, completing that risk assessment to ensure that we've got appropriate allergen communication to the consumer. And obviously having these things implemented within your business ultimately at the end really does help demonstrate your commitment to the consumer, but also to obviously food safety culture, to also ensuring that your due diligence is in place as well, sort of as you navigate sort of all of those regulatory environments. So with that, I just want to say a very big thank you again to BSI for the opportunity to jump on board today. Definitely go to the Allergen Bureau website and have a look at the resources there that are available for you, and I'll be around for questions at the end.
Thank you, Jasmine. And let's call our third speaker, Leanne Singleton. She will be presenting about reducing food loss and waste. So Leanne, over to you.
Thank you.
Again, sorry, before we start, Leanne, I just want to inform everyone again, please feel free to write your questions on the Q&A box. We will answer all the questions towards the end, after Leanne's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Titi. And thank you, Jasmine. That was very detailed. And I know that allergens have been leading cause of recalls globally, so it's really important that we get that right. You're going to hear a lot of synergy because I'm going to be talking about a food waste assessment. So we'll just get that presentation up. Here we go. Food waste assessment. So it'll be similar to looking at an allergen management assessment, except we're going to talk about food waste. So thank you for having me speak about something that I'm so passionate about. I work for Stop Food Waste Australia. Just by way of an introduction of that organisation, we are a public-private partnership established with money from the Australian government, leading Australia's food waste reduction strategy. And Stop Food Waste Australia administers the Pact, which is a voluntary agreement with many of Australia's large food manufacturing organisations and food service organisations to help them measure and reduce their waste. So tackling food waste, and thanks to Todd for the introduction at the start, this truly is a global issue, and there's a real sense of urgency about dealing with this. I'm always astounded when I go through this slide. A third of all food produced is wasted. 1 billion people are going to bed hungry every night, and a huge proportion of this wasted food is dumped in landfill, where it releases methane into the atmosphere, a greenhouse gas. Food waste is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and all the food we waste requires an area the size of 1.25 Australias to grow it. So that's a huge landmass for food that will never be consumed. It feeds climate change, and it is a global problem. And looking at this statistic that 1 in 3 bags of groceries is going to go into the bin, I find that astounding. So when we work in our food industry role and we go home, we're all consumers. And what's that saying is that when we go to the grocery store and we walk out with 3 bags full of food, we could put one of those 3 bags in the bin as we leave the store to save ourselves the trouble later. So it's a phenomenal amount of waste that is happening across the entire food supply chain, from farming through to processing and manufacturing, logistics, distribution, retail, and consumer. So linking to what Todd said earlier, the world does have a solution for this. We have the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So 12.3, the Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 calls for halving per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels and reducing food loss along production and supply chains by 2030. We are already in 2023. So we have less than 7 years to actually make some real traction on this. I think the real benefit about addressing food loss and waste is that in many respects it's the low-hanging fruit. So there's so much opportunity to reduce food waste across the entire food supply chain that if we do that, then we're also going to have a positive impact on sustainable water management, climate change, marine resources, ecosystems, forestry, and biodiversity. So we're going to have a positive impact on some of the other sustainable development goals by starting with reduction of food loss and waste. I just wanted to overview the food waste recovery hierarchy for you. And this is taken from the FAO document. And it's really important to understand in the food industry that the aim of reducing food loss and waste is to actually move our waste as high up the hierarchy that we can. So if we have food waste that is currently going to landfill, we need to see how far up the hierarchy we can safely move that food. So ideally what we want to do is we want to repurpose or transform or reduce waste so that we keep our actions in the prevention part of this food waste recovery hierarchy. So what we want to do is that if food grown for human consumption can't be processed and sold as food for human consumption, then the next best option is that it's going to be repurposed or upcycled into a new food. If we can't do that, it's donated to food rescue or to people to consume in not-for-profit organisations. And then if it can't be sent for people to eat, then it goes to animal feed and pet food. Once we drop down to recycling options, which include biogas production and organic composting, it's not helping us meet that target of halving food loss and waste. So really important that people understand it's not just about diverting from landfill into composting. Certainly composting is better than landfill, but it's moving food as high up that recovery hierarchy as we can. Sorry, just skipped a slide there. I just wanted to touch on the cost of food loss and waste because I think that all industry understands this when we start talking money. So I realise that we have all of our friends across APAC joining us for this webinar. I only have the statistics for Australia, but if we look at the cost of food waste and lost in Australia alone, it's around 36.6 billion per annum. And when we break that down, we can see that agriculture accounts for approximately $1.1 to $2 billion of waste every year. Post-harvest loss, which is when we pick the produce, we harvest produce, and yet we don't get the crop to market. That's another, 700,000, sorry, 0.7 to 1.2 billion. I shouldn't go converting while I'm on a webinar. Processing losses, again, up to 1.2 billion. Distribution losses, around 1.7 billion. Food service, a whopping 3.5 billion. And if we talk about food loss and waste at the food service sector, we're talking about predominantly plate waste, what people get put on their plate that they don't consume. And then if we look at household waste, we're up around 10 billion plus. So I think it goes to show us that there is so much that can be done. And when we think about our own action as consumers, there's a lot that we need to do as consumers, just as much as what we do need to do in addressing food loss and waste across the food supply chain. Really important point here is that we know that there's a return of $7 to $14 return on every dollar that a business spends on reducing food loss and waste. So it makes economic sense to look at how you can reduce your food loss and waste because it will improve your bottom line. And I challenge everybody on the webinar today to think about whether or not you would recognise food waste when you saw it. I've been in the food industry for well over 20 years. And I've spent most of my time as a food safety auditor. And in that time, I would often walk into warehouses because I would be looking at how well product that was non-conforming had been segregated. And it was nothing to see 20 pallets with quarantine tape around them. And I would diligently ask the question, what's going to happen to them? And I was relieved when they'd tell me that they were just waiting to write them off the books and that they were going to landfill so that they could be safely and securely disposed of. And I reflect on that now, and I just think of the fact that I didn't recognise that as waste when I saw that. That was just non-conforming product. That was just a cost of doing business. And that's just what happened in food industry when you're manufacturing. But now I look at it with a different focus to say, that's a huge amount of waste. How many times have you stood back and waved at the forklift driver as they trundle past you with a palicon of waste going out to animal feed and never actually thought of that as a lost opportunity to convert raw materials to finished product? So I just want to quickly cover off some definitions around food, inedible parts and waste. So food is any substance, whether processed, semi-processed or raw, that is intended for human consumption. It includes inedible parts associated with food. Food sold as intended is the food sold for human consumption as intended. So this doesn't include food that's been repurposed and upcycled into new foods that would have been disposed of if not repurposed. And inedible parts are the components associated with a food not intended to be consumed, but they include things like seeds, bones, coffee grinds, peels, pits and stones. And look, for those of you that are based in Australia, I just want to highlight that our food waste definition includes solid and liquid food, and that food that is imported in and disposed of in Australia is counted towards our target to reduce food waste, as is food that is produced or manufactured for export but doesn't leave Australia. So I'm leading up and trying to set a little bit of the context around the importance of measuring food waste before we start reducing food waste so that we can be sure that we're having an impact. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the requirement that FSSC version 6 have introduced in their standard as of April 2023, which is the inclusion of food loss and waste in their additional requirements. And I believe that they're just the first of all of the GFSI standards who will in some way or form add a mandatory requirement for food safety certification to also include reduction of food loss and waste. So the first of these requirements is that an organisation has to have a documented policy and objectives detailing the organisation's strategy to reduce food loss and waste within their organisation and the related supply chain. So that's what I want to spend the rest of the webinar speaking about today, is the how do you do this? The other requirements relate to controls in place for products that are donated to not-for-profit organisations, and your general food safety management system should cover these foods. The other requirements look at managing surplus products or byproducts that are intended to animal feed to prevent contamination of these products. Again, this should already be addressed in your food safety management system. And there's a requirement that processors comply with applicable legislation in the country of manufacture. They're kept up to date and they don't have a negative impact on food safety. So the first poll that we want to put to the group is, does your organisation measure its food loss and waste? So if everybody would just contribute to this, it'll be really interesting to see where we're at as an APAC region. And until we start measuring our food loss and waste, we really don't know how big that problem is. And I can say that for many of the organisations we've worked with, it hasn't been until they've measured their food waste that they understand the extent of the problem. And this goes back to not recognising waste as waste when you see waste, and also not being able to potentially manipulate the information you keep to get exact data on how much waste goes to landfill, how much goes to composting, how much goes to animal feed. Okay, so we'll leave that poll open just for a few more minutes and I'll continue on the presentation. Okay, so what is the Target Measure Act approach? So this is what we commonly use in food loss and waste systems, and it's about 3 key activities that we need to do. The first one is targeting. So targeting our food loss and waste sets ambition. Thank you. That poll result is up. Let's talk about it now. So, wow, that's fantastic. 58% of businesses are measuring their food loss and waste. That's excellent. 28% said no. So that is a huge opportunity for you to do that. And fair enough, 14% are unsure because you might not be the people involved in doing that. So that's great. Thank you very much for contributing to that. So the majority are measuring food waste. So set targets on what food loss and waste do you want to achieve within your business? Because if we set a target, we hold ourselves accountable to that. Sorry, I didn't mean for that slide to skip over. Next part is measuring. So what gets measured gets managed. So quantifying our food loss and waste within operations or supply chains is going to provide an evidence-based foundation for prioritising our interventions. So we need to make sure that we are having an impact and that we are actually achieving the targets that we've set. And don't be surprised when you first start measuring your food waste, you might actually have to use some fairly rudimentary numbers to do that, but it's better to make a start. So do the best you can, and you might find the second year you go to measure your food waste that you actually have an increase in food waste. It's not that you have an actual increase in food waste, it just means that some of those measurement capabilities may have been refined since the first time that you looked at specifically measuring food loss and waste. And then the last part of this is acting. So looking at how we can reduce food waste at scale, and it requires numerous actors in our supply chain. So everybody has a part to play, just like in food safety. And I love the synergy that we have between HACCP food safety program, preventative food safety programs, and we have in prevention of food waste. Every supply chain actor needs to reduce their food loss and waste, and we don't want to shift waste from one part of the supply chain to another. So let's have a look at what some of these, what some of the strategies we can use to do this. So just like we have a food safety team in an organisation, and we might have a team that looks at food fraud prevention, and we have a team that looks at food defence, we also need a food waste action team. So our food waste action team should pull together all the people in our organisation that can problem solve and help us look at what are the solutions that we can use within our own business and then across our supply chain. So think about including people that are involved in continuous improvement, because they're already very familiar with these processes. We absolutely need the input of people in production, because they're involved with the product every single day, and they'll have a lot of detailed information as to where we have waste, how much we have, and what are the day-to-day impacts on the volume of waste. We need site leadership team involved so that they can sponsor any of the solutions that we're going to put in play. And maintenance teams, for any automated process, we absolutely need the input of maintenance teams to look at how we can reduce food waste that may be caused from equipment-related issues. Corporate sustainability team will also have valuable inputs around company targets that need to be met. And our quality department, they will be excellent to have involved as anchors to a food waste action team, because they're very aware of the systematic process that we apply for food safety management and for allergen management is going to be the same type of skill set that we need applied to food waste prevention. Procurement teams have an important role too, because through sustainable procurement practices, they can ensure that we are not bringing waste in through the way that we procure our raw materials. And new product development is a critical part of any food waste action team, because through Better by Design, they can look at how they can potentially transform some of our waste outputs or our byproducts into new products, or find new markets to valorize the waste that we have. And obviously our finance department will be there to look at what sort of cost savings we can make through reduction of food waste. Okay, so look, just the next poll question, the second of 3 questions, is: are you aware of any food loss and waste hotspots within your business? So please contribute to this, because it is really insightful to see how many people are already looking for where they have a hotspot of food waste within their own procedures. And we'll talk about those poll results as soon as we get them in. So what we're using in our organisation is a 12-step process to help businesses identify how can they reduce food waste within their own business. So the first one is forming that food waste action team that we spoke about. The next thing to do is selecting a particular product or process to assess. So this is the detailed look at what you do within your business. Then, just like we do in a food safety assessment, take a copy of your flow diagram and walk the particular production line you've assessed. What we're looking for is a step-by-step review of the process as to where do you have all of your waste outputs. And some of you will already have flow diagrams which include these waste outputs. You then need to look at where do you have a large amount of waste. Okay, great, thank you. So just looking at the poll, 70% of you know where your waste hotspots are. That's fantastic. 9% don't. What a great opportunity. 12% unsure. Thank you. I think that's a wonderful result that 70% of people know where their waste hotspots are. Once we know where those hotspots are, and we're talking tons, generally not kilos, we're talking tons of waste per annum, quantifying them. How much waste do we have at a particular waste output? Identifying the waste complexities. So what makes it difficult about this waste for me to return it to production, for me to use it in another product? Prioritize our food waste hotspots. Apply some root cause analysis to understand all of the underlying causes for the hotspot, because it's likely there will be more than one cause for the waste. Identify the actions to address the hotspots, prioritize those actions, identify any barriers within your own organisation to implementing those actions, and implementing an action plan. So we spoke about selecting the product and process, walking the line. Focus on your known food waste issues. Look where you have any high volume processes, because even if you have a yield of, let's say, 95%, 5% could still be a substantial amount of waste that you need to address. Look at your high value inputs. So it's looking at valorizing those raw material inputs to say which ones are the ones that we can't afford to have any food waste because they have a high value. Also have a look at your high value finished products. Look at any difficult to dispose of waste to say, what else can I do to valorize this waste? And look at processes where we know the waste is designated to a landfill disposal. So walk the entire material flow, use the flow chart with you to mark up food waste outputs, talk with operators and supervisors, and look at your food waste data and destinations to help you focus on the hotspots. So identifying food waste hotspots. Pay attention to highly automated processes. So we know from our experience working with organisations that optical sorting, metal detection and X-ray can be points that generate a lot of waste within a process. We spoke about high volume processes generating waste even if the yield is high, and start with processes with avoidable waste. So what we want to do is make some traction and have some impact. So if we have avoidable waste, target that before you look at the more difficult inherent waste or unavoidable waste. And a hotspot is where the food waste output is sufficiently large or the compositional value warrants exploring for more value. And again, we said tons, not kilograms. Quantifying food waste at hotspots, and I'm very conscious of my time here, just have a look at the data you have. So do you have waste data available at each hotspot? When and where to measure? Which quantification method are you going to use? And I just want to talk to this one to say, a lot of businesses have said, we don't have a resource available to measure our food waste output on trade certified scales. You don't need to do that. Just get started and you can do an approximation. So if you know that half a palicon full of a particular product weighs about 300 kilos, a visual approximation is good enough to make a start on this process. And think about any contributing factors to the waste. Identify any complexities with your food waste. So consider any of the inherent complexity with your food waste that makes it more challenging for you to manage this waste. So do you need to think about the temperature of the waste and moving it back into temperature controlled storage? Do you need to manage accumulation time or have a frequency of collection that prevents an accumulation time that would prevent you upcycling or repurposing the waste? Is there the potential for contamination in the way that you collect the waste, and can that be addressed to give you more options for what to do with the waste? Do you need further processing of the waste, and do you have a storage capacity issue, which means you can't store the waste that you generate on the site? Prioritize your hotspots and apply root cause analysis. So when we look at prioritizing hotspots, we recommend that you look at things that fall in the bottom part of the quadrant in the just do it section and the quick wins. So look for ease of implementation against impact. The hard but worth it, we need to do it, but set that as a future initiative and just get going on the just do it and the quick wins. And root cause analysis, I'm not going to cover in this webinar, but techniques that you already use for food safety, like 5 Whys and Ishikawa, cause and effect, you can apply these to food waste in the same way. Identify actions for a food waste plan, and these include any actions to prevent waste, reduce waste, eliminate waste, or actions to transform waste into other products. And I'm just going to skip ahead to another slide because there will be a PDF made available of these presentations after the webinar. And I just want to quickly talk about causes of food loss and waste across the supply chain. So once you've looked at waste reduction, food waste reduction within your own business, you can then take the binoculars out and have a look across your supply chain to say upstream and downstream, what are the opportunities by collaboratively getting everybody in the same room to talk about what are the individual things you can do for a particular product and process, right from primary production or farming, right through to retail display for sale. And there's some examples that are given here on how there's little things at every step in the supply chain that accumulate to provide a very high volume of waste. And just looking at processing, because I imagine that most people on the webinar today are from manufacturing processing facilities. Design of facilities and processes not being specific to products can be a big contributor to waste. Technical malfunction of equipment, another big contributor. Human errors or behaviours also drive waste, particularly when we've built up so much effort to have very strict specifications at every step in our process, which are more based on appearance of product, perhaps on a colour of a product, but in doing so and creating such a high standard for quality, we're also driving a huge amount of food waste. Line efficiencies, and I just make a comment that if you've been through a lean manufacturing process, you will have inbuilt waste tolerances. So when you celebrate a zero waste day, you're not celebrating zero waste, you're celebrating that you've met your waste tolerance. So go back and say, can I nudge some of those waste tolerances to reduce the amount of waste that's acceptable? And then opportunities to transform waste into alternative applications. Have a think about what are all of the things that we can do with our waste to valorize it. Can it be upcycled into another product? Can it go to insect production, which might be a higher value waste valorization than sending it to organic composting? Can it go to animal feed? Can it go into pet food? So what's happening next? In summary, we have just received approval from Australian Standards for the development of an interim food loss and waste standard, which is going to come out ahead of the ISO standard for food loss and waste. So we're particularly excited about that development because it will mean probably towards the end of 2024, we will have an Australian standard that sets a consistent framework on how an organisation can go about reducing food loss and waste. We also have Australian sector action plans that are being released, and you can access these on the Stop Food Waste Australia website. And it doesn't matter if you're outside Australia, you can still access these documents and download them for free with a whole lot of information on hotspots and the solutions for those hotspots. We also are looking at opportunities to introduce upcycling and certification of upcycled products. And we're always working with research partners to look at additional ways for waste valorization. And if you are in Australia, talk to us about joining the Australia Pact. So we would like to finish with the last poll question, which is, would your organisation be interested in a certification for an upcycled product or ingredient that you were able to make a claim on to promote the fact that you had contributed to a sustainable solution for a food waste product? So thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry, I felt like I had so much information I wanted to give in a short period of time, but don't hesitate to reach out to me. and I'm very happy to help with anything I can after the webinar. Thank you very much. Thank you, Titi.
Thank you, Leanne. So maybe we'll see what's the answer is for this, the result for the poll
Yes,
question.
please. Okay, good. So 32%, great. And fair enough that 58% are unsure, because they're like, well, have we got anything that we can upcycle? So thank you so much for contributing to that.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Leanne. And thank you for all the speakers for sharing their insights and knowledge. And now I would like to invite all the speakers to open the video for our Q&A sessions. Okay, so we have a few questions already in the Q&A box. So first, we have a question about this allergen. So how can we know the acceptance limit of different types of allergen in different countries? I'd like to just...
No, that's perfect. So look, there's probably two parts. So one is, what are the different allergens in all the different countries? I will put a link in the answers in a second. So the Food Allergy Research and Resource Program, who are based in the University of Nebraska, have a wonderful comparison chart that lists all of the allergens across all of the jurisdictions. So I would definitely recommend that as a go-to, and they update it quite frequently. With respect to free from, so the comment there around gluten being less than 20 parts per million, that is only applicable for gluten-free, and that is different in different jurisdictions around the world. So I would be recommending that if you're purchasing products with the claim or one with the claim, that you need to go to the specific country and understand what those legal requirements are, because they are different across the board.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I'd like to go over to Leanne. We know that we still have a lot of confusion on the requirements of FSSC regarding this food loss and food waste. So how the food chain can how to set up the objective of food loss and food waste in a food chain? Mm-hmm. Any recommendation on that?
Sure. So when looking, and I've been looking at the questions in the box, I think the question is about how do we actually engage our supply chain to look at reducing food loss and waste for an entire supply chain. And look, there's nothing magical about this. It's picking up the phone and talking to your suppliers and talking to your logistics business and talking to your retailer to say, can we actually convene a meeting where we all come together and we all talk about this problem just for one day? And look, we've run a few workshops called Walk the Chain workshops or Walk the Value Chain workshops, and they've been highly successful in getting everybody in the same room, just talking collaboratively about what each of them can do. And it's through this partnership arrangement that we can have the most impact. If we did it as a business and we just thought, this is what I'll put on my suppliers and this is what I'll make the retailers do, it's not going to have the same impact, because everybody needs to be part of that solution to make sure that what we're requesting is capable of the people upstream and downstream. So it is a collaborative approach to do that.
Thanks, Leanne. Just a follow-up question. Is there any other food safety standard required food loss and waste?
Good question. At this point in time, it's only FSSC version 6. However, I know that the GFSI benchmark standard is currently under review, and should the GFSI benchmark standard include food loss and waste as one of the mandatory benchmark requirements, then all of the GFSI benchmark standards for BRCGS and SQF, a global gap, etc., will then be required to make an adjustment to meet that GFSI benchmark gap. So look, I think that when one does it, we can safely assume, future-proofing our standards, that in time, everybody will do it. Todd, did you have anything to add to that?
Sorry,
sorry.
No, I'm not aware of any others moving, but I think you're right, Leanne. Generally when one goes, they follow. But importantly, it's what GFSI does with the benchmark. the last time the benchmark was changed was 2020. So we'd be looking at, potentially an evolution of that as well, and could well do, particularly because if you go back to those coalitions of actions from from the Consumer Goods Forum that I showed very early in my piece, food waste does fit back up in there. So they may try to cross-pollinate that across into GFSI. Hard to know exactly what's going to happen.
Thank you, Todd and Leanne. So I'd like to go over to Todd. There was questions about the food safety culture. So what is the most challenging factor for the organization to adopt this food safety culture?
Yeah, if you remember me saying that every organisation has a food safety culture, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a very positive one, but it could well be, and it could already have quite a mature one. I believe that the most challenging factor will be, once you've got an improvement, is maintaining that. So it's quite easy for things to slip and for that culture to go into some form of demise. So keeping the attention, keeping the momentum up, and encouraging people to always be thinking along those lines is one of the hardest factors. But if you've got the right people and you've got the entire organisation on board, the leadership is well and truly committed, the resourcing is there, and that culture allows for people to speak up and make mistakes and not be persecuted for it, well, then that's a very positive way of moving forward. So I would say momentum is difficult to keep up, but if you've got the right attitude and the right leadership, it's a lot easier to maintain.
Thank you, Todd. I'd like to go over to Jasmine. This is a very interesting questions about this allergen request in the restaurant's kitchen setting. So how to handle and manage this allergen request in restaurants, because for me also sometimes I ask, I cannot take this, I have allergy and this thing. So when it is unable to manage airborne cross-contamination, for especially guests or consumer with serious allergy disease.
Yeah.
How to handle.
Yeah, no, perfect. And great question. And I think, the food service restaurant space is definitely different from the manufacturing environment, but a lot of the philosophies or processes and practices that are used in the manufacturing area are applicable, though slightly different within our food service facilities. So, the idea of having an allergen management program, knowing what ingredients contain allergens, how you're segregating them, what your processes are to try and reduce the risk of cross contact from one allergen into a meal that you're making. But I think the most important thing that we need to really sort of, come back to when we look at risks within a food service setting is what the data tells us within the Australian and New Zealand environment, and I know the same in the UK and America, is that where we see people having reactions when they have a food allergy in a restaurant setting, many times it's not because of airborne dust, it's not because of small amounts of cross-contamination, it's because the meal that they were served contained high levels of the allergen that they're allergic to. So either the wrong ingredient completely was used, or the wrong meal was given to the wrong patient, or wrong customer. So I think, if we're looking at how do we manage allergens in those settings, knowing what allergen containing ingredients you have, making sure that the recipe is right, making sure the right meal goes to the right person are the real critical things when we're looking around public health safety for these individuals.
Thanks, Jasmine. Also, we have a question from a company who is producing goods majorly contains allergen. So around 80% of their finished products are mostly allergen based. So while of course the application of allergen management are compulsory by the government, is it enough just to inform the customer that their products contain allergens?
Yeah, so look, I think even though the legislation will vary across the different sectors, I mean, obviously making sure that your customers know what products you're producing and what allergens are intentionally added is critical. And obviously having an allergen management program is important, but it's also important to manage the reduction of risk. So even though you might have 80% of the products in your facility that contain all of the allergens, you'll have 20% that you're making that don't contain them or only contain one or two. So still making sure you've got good practices in place to identify and reduce the risk so that those allergens that are not intended to be in those products aren't, essentially. So I'm thinking back to Leanne, your presentation, the parallels around risk management and assessment sort of through the processes are so very similar, almost irrespective of what we're trying to manage to some degree.
Thank you. So we'd like to go over to Leanne. There's another question on the regulations for so is there any regulation that prescribe the food manufacturers to consider or reduce the food waste in their supply chain?
Not that I'm aware of. It's a difficult question to answer because it's going to depend on every single country. So I can only answer on behalf of Australia to say at this point in time, it is not a regulatory requirement. It is a voluntary agreement, and industry are encouraged to do this as an industry initiative through the development and contribution to sector action plans. Look, obviously things in the EU are quite different, and we are seeing in the EU that there's quite a strong regulatory push. And I guess one that I could speak to that I think is potentially going to impact everybody is the EU requirement around the use of sustainability claims, and which is the requirement that any sustainability claim needs to be able to be independently verified, with examples being certification programs. So hence I think that getting ahead of certifications in terms of certifying to a food loss and waste standard, certifying to the use of an upcycled product or upcycled ingredient are going to be important ways for businesses to start telling their story about their commitment to sustainability.
Okay, thank you, Leanne. And this is going to be the last question for Jasmine. Is every company have to establish their own limit of detection for each allergen?
Oh, that's again, that's probably a hard question to answer, just depending upon exactly what avenue we're talking about. So we would definitely, if a business has implemented a vital risk assessment approach, then for each product that you're producing, you will definitely determine the level of risk that you need to manage at, for sure. If the question is pitched around analysis, then that's probably a question that I would have to answer offline, unfortunately, only because of the complexity involved in being able to answer that one.
Okay, thank you very much. So that was the last question and the end of our web. Hope this webinar provided you with some valuable insights, and I wish you all a nice day. Thank you.